What we're going to do today is hear from Dr. Stephanie Savell, who's the co-director of the Cost of War Project. She has a PhD in anthropology from Brown University. She's been working on the cost of United States post-9/11 security assistance, and she'll be talking about the particular conflict that she did intensive work on, Burkina Faso. But she's also done incredible work on the global security assistance program. So we're lucky to have her. Stephanie will talk for about 20, 25 minutes, maybe a little bit more, I'm not sure. And then we'll have a Q&A, a live Q&A. Thank you so much for joining them. Away to you, Dr. Savell.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here. We had originally scheduled this webinar for a few weeks ago. So I thank you for your participation. And I'm also just so I think this presentation is actually more relevant than ever with the news of the impending troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. I say that if we're going to truly end the endless wars, we have to acknowledge their full scope. And so this presentation will, I hope, really inform your thinking about that. So my talk today is called The Costs of United States Post-9/11 Security Assistance: How Counterterrorism Intensified Conflict in Burkina Faso and Around the World. This is based on a paper that came out on the Cost of War Project site at the beginning of March. And what I will tell you about in the paper is making the case for that what's going on in Burkina Faso, the conflict there, is partially an extension of George W. Bush's global war on terror, launched in 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, the origins of the current conflict in the Sahel are very complex. There are multiple parties responsible for the violence, and the US plays a pretty minor role on the ground, especially compared to France. But my work looks at the role of the US in particular in this conflict, and it highlights that the role of the US narrative of the war on terror, the money and the institutional supports behind this narrative, have been a major factor in shaping what's going on the ground, and hardly any of the media is talking about this. So the fact is that a war paradigm approach to dealing with the problem of militant violence is not inevitable. Historical research shows that it's actually remarkably ineffective. And this slide is based on a RAND study of 268 militant groups between 1968 to 2006 that looked at how the violence was resolved. And you can see here, 43% of these cases were resolved through peaceful political accommodation, negotiating with the parties responsible for the violence, development, humanitarian, kind of getting to the root of the grievances that lead people to join these kinds of groups in the first place. 40% through kind of a classic, policing approach, like treating militants as a problem, militant violence as a problem that can be addressed with policing and intelligence and surveillance and things like that. 10% of groups achieved their objectives by violence and ceased their activity, and then only 7% of groups have ended because of a war on terror, a military approach to the problem of militant violence. Since just after 9/11, what the United States has done in the West African Sahel is to set them up to respond to the problem of Islamist violence when it arose with their own domestic wars on terror. I'm talking about a particular region here. This is about, you can see kind of these incidents of violence involving jihadist groups in the last couple of years. The red is all these violent incidents. So this is Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in particular. Nigeria has its own history of militant violence with Boko Haram, and I'm not talking about that today. My paper is based on firsthand interviews in January 2020, so just before the pandemic started, in Burkina Faso's capital, which is Ouagadougou. I interviewed displaced people, journalists, activists, scholars, former government officials, nonprofit staff, and others as well. And I've also based the paper in a deep set of secondary research with articles and think tank analyses and things like that. Just to kind of set the context for this paper, I see it as a deep dive into a data point on this map, which Dr. Crawford mentioned. This is all the places in the world where the US is conducting some sort of counterterrorism operation. You can see, airstrikes in red, combat with those orange blast icons. And then the majority, 79 countries, were doing counterterrorism training and assistance. And this is kind of a deep dive into what that actually means on the ground. Just to kind of set the stage for you, in 2020, there were at least 1,000 violent incidents linked to militant groups across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This was a 7-fold increase since 2017. And here you can see that dramatic escalation with the blue bars on the right. You can also see the geography of the conflict in the country. You can see the blue dots here that are, all the violent incidents in the north and then the east. This has had an enormous human toll. Thousands of civilians have been killed. Over 1 million people have been displaced because of militant and state violence. At least 350,000 children are lacking access to education. 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, particularly vulnerable now with the ravages of the pandemic. Shortly after 9/11, then, the US quickly began expanding its footprint across Africa. The logic being that we needed to extend counterterrorism activity to the, quote, ungoverned spaces where Islamist groups could potentially gain a foothold and thus threaten US interests. The US began establishing a network of bases and training and security assistance programs, including weapons, donations, and sales across the continent. At the time, US strategists saw the main terrorist threat from Africa as emanating from the Horn, which is Somalia and East Africa. But the US State Department nonetheless established the Pan-Sahel Initiative in 2003 and began to train rapid response military units from Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Quickly, US personnel began to describe the initiative not as a training program, but as a means of tracking down suspected terrorists, especially those affiliated with an Algerian group with links to Al-Qaeda, the predecessor of what would later become Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. In 2005, the Pan-Sahel Initiative became the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, the TSTCP, and it was expanded to include more countries. Even though as late as 2010, a regional expert said the threat of violent jihadi activity in this region is very small. Burkina Faso was added to the TSTCP in 2009, despite the fact that US officials had identified no terrorist threat there. So the question becomes, why the Sahel? Scholars have suggested that a few different reasons. It could be that we're trying to maintain a geopolitical presence to counter the influence of Russia and China. It could be that there are some interests in the natural resources in the region, including gold. Arguably, it's also about the kind of racialized logics introduced by the war on terror itself. And President George W. Bush used centuries-old racialized language to claim he wanted the US military to be ready to strike at any moment's notice, in his words, in any dark corner of the world. In theory, the TSTCP has a holistic approach to counterterrorism that includes development and public diplomacy. So it's a loosely coordinated set of initiatives run not just by the Pentagon, but also by the State Department, USAID, Department of Justice, and others. In practice, however, rather than attempting to address any of the fundamental structural challenges like poverty that are driving instability in the region, US officials have really focused on training elite counterterrorism units and providing military equipment as the most cost-effective way of countering local Islamist militants. Watchdog groups have long accused the TSTCP of mismanagement and inadequate oversight. And here you can see the dramatic rise of US security assistance to Burkina Faso since it entered the TSTCP in 2009, both on its own and comparison with other economic aid. That's the chart on the right. There are especially big spikes after 2012 when the conflict in neighboring Mali broke out and in the last few years. And this is only a partial accounting of publicly disclosed funding, but it shows you the general trends and the dramatic spikes that have happened, especially since 2012. And here you can see the corresponding rise in Burkina Faso's military expenditures over the same time period. It's not a complete accounting of all that the country is spending on counterterrorism, especially because a lot of the counterterrorism fighting is actually being carried out by the gendarme, which is a unit of the police. But still, it's enough to kind of get the idea that this the US really set Burkina Faso up for a war paradigm response to counterterrorism. And that the military expenditure is kind of tracking the US security assistance money. So very briefly, the history of the conflict. In 2011, a US and NATO-backed revolution in Libya toppled longtime Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi, and the regime's weapons arsenals were looted by various Libyan rebel groups. These groups had ties to separatist Tuareg movements and Islamist militants based in Mali. Remember, I mentioned Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, that was the same group that had kind of splintered and spread. Soon the militant groups kind of gained the upper hand over these separatist groups in Mali, and the international community, concerned that the violence would spread, as indeed it has. France launched Operation Savell in 2012. The UN started a peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, in 2013. France in 2014 transition from Serval to what is today known as Operation Barkhane, and that continues. Again, France has taken the lead in the so-called war on terror in the region, but today there are an estimated 20,000 soldiers from Europe, the UN, including from other African nations, and the US in Mali and the region. And throughout, the US has provided critical support to France's combat operations by airlifting soldiers and supplies, flying refueling missions, providing drone, signal, and satellite intelligence. And this was something that a representative of the French embassy in Burkina Faso told me. He said, without American surveillance operations, Barkhane would not be able to operate. It's absolutely essential. So just to turn now to the ways that the consequences of Burkina Faso's own domestic war on terror. It has used this war on terror to repress an ethnic group, the Fulani, to justify undemocratic governments and to facilitate illicit profiteering. So an army communications officer told me, his quote was, "It's not that all Fulani are terrorists, it's that most terrorists are Fulani," and they call them Peul in French. In the past several years, the country's Forces de Défense et Sécurité, most Burkinabe refer to them as the FDS, they've extrajudicially executed at least 588 to 1,016 civilians, and likely many more. A local human rights group warns that the government's widespread ethnic killing may soon make the country the next Rwanda. Of Burkina Faso's approximately 19 million inhabitants, over 1 million are Fulani, about 6% of the population. The Fulani are traditionally nomadic herders who live across West Africa, and the central government is dominated by the Mossi, which is the country's majority ethnic group. The tension between the government and the Fulani minority is a reverberation of the colonial era in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. During that time, France instituted a politique des races in order to facilitate its system of indirect rule. the French named certain ethnic groups state leaders while denigrating others as tribes. And the Fulani, among other minorities, have long felt discriminated against and marginalized by a government that does not feel their own. So just kind of zooming out for a moment, many governments throughout the Islamic world have used US training and assistance in the similar ways to kind of consolidate power over these marginalized tribal groups. And this has worsened domestic conflicts, most of which predate 9/11. For generations, central governments have carried out harsh assimilation policies to civilized tribes, including massacre, forced relocation, systematic rape, and banning local languages in the press and in schools. For instance, the Malian government in the 1970s dealt with Tuareg rebellions in the north by capturing and killing Tuareg leaders, as well as targeting these herders by poisoning their wells, which were located in the middle of desolate stretches of the Sahara Desert, and implementing a deliberate policy of starvation. After 9/11, counterterrorism has become the latest excuse for this kind of suppression. And this photo is a photo of the Yerugu Massacre, January 1st to the 3rd, 2019. A big part of the conflict in Burkina Faso today is that the government has empowered local militia groups called the Cogliogo. And what happened on this date is that uh, local militia groups, the Cogliogo, consisting largely of Mossi men, they mobilized in retaliation for the murder of a Mossi chief by men they accused of being jihadists. So they, over the course of several days in Yerugu and surrounding hamlets, the Cogliogo killed up to 220 Fulani men, including boys and elderly. The current administration, President Kabure's administration, failed to condemn the atrocity, and even have gone so far as to overtly support the Cogliogo. In January 2020, the Burkina Parliament voted to arm local volunteers across the country to fight jihadists. By some estimates, there are over 92,000 armed men in Cogliogo militias today. At the same time, Islamist militants target villages of all ethnic groups, including the Fulani, with violent attacks. And my Fulani interviewees claim that they feel caught between two fires, vulnerable to the attacks and targeted disappearances of both militants and government security forces, of which local people tend to include these volunteer militias called the Cogliogo. This graphic shows who's doing the killing. So you can see in green, these are what local people often call them jihadist groups. In blue, you can see the state security people killed by state security forces. So again, kind of an equal number killed by the state and by these jihadist groups. You can see people killed by these militia groups, the Cogliogo in pink, unidentified in white. And just to that's just kind of a glimpse of the complexity of the conflict, which I'll just add to by saying that part of what's at stake here too is a tension between different livelihood groups. So for example, one interview recounted how during a long drought, a Fulani man traveled with his herd for several years. And as is often done, he allowed a man of a different ethnic group to borrow a plot of land to farm. When the herder finally returned, he found that the farmer had taken over much more of his land than originally agreed on. And shortly afterwards, the herder was apprehended and later killed by the state forces. So the interviewee suspected that the farmer had found an expedient way to take over the land he desired by accusing the herder of being a jihadist. Another layer of complexity in the conflict, government and Western donor-led development interventions and incentives have privileged sedentary modes of life, such as of the Mossi, over nomadic modes of life, such as of the Fulani. Desertification and climate change have also increasingly threatened the livelihoods of pastoralist groups, such as the Fulani, forcing them further afield in search of adequate grazing for their herds and raising tensions over land use. And the reason why I went into a little bit of depth here is to kind of convey the kind of intricate sets of historical, political, cultural, environmental relations, right, between central government and minority ethnic groups dating back to colonialism, between state-sanctioned self-defense militias and their targets, between livelihood groups, between Western development models and pastoralist lifestyles, between unequal neighbors, among others. It's into these intricate sets of relationships that the US inserts its post 9/11 understandings and logics and resources. And these local dynamics are far more complex than a logic that suggests that there's a good state that combats evil terrorists. Introduced into local context, counterterrorism takes on a life of its own, and deployed by governments who use it to target and repress minority groups, it has enormous human and societal costs. Just looking at the time. Yeah, okay, great. So just very briefly, a couple other things. The war on terror in Burkina Faso has justified under undemocratic governments. There's a law that criminalizes any journalism or public speech that could demoralize defense forces or compromise an intervention by security forces in an act of terrorism. It essentially makes many people in Burkina Faso afraid to speak openly about the conflict. And again, illicit profiteering, researchers have documented evidence of key corruption indicators in the Burkinabe defense sector, including non-merit promotions, delayed salaries, widespread bribery, and illicit military business. In 2011, junior personnel in the Burkinabe military led a mutiny, revolting against and accusing senior officers of illicit profiteering. Soldiers even set fire to the houses of some officers in protest of their lavish lifestyles, as these officers are among the wealthiest members of their societies. In the past decade, Burkina Faso was one of 9 West African countries to experience military mutinies, signaling a pattern of corruption and extreme inequality between different ranks. So what does all this do? Basically, I have the word blowback on the slide because that's the best way to describe it. My interview suggested that the government targeting of the Fulani has given the militants a powerful recruiting device. So an interviewee described how Burkinabe security forces murdered a small town mayor, the father of a relatively well-to-do Fulani family. His children, a female nurse and a male college student, were so enraged that they joined a militant group to seek revenge for their father's death. These young people were so motivated that they spent their own money to buy the motorcycle they needed to join the group, which the interviewee wanted to tell me. It was a telling detail in such an impoverished country. According to Diallo Soyebu, president of a nonprofit that works with Fulani religious leaders to promote peace, about 80% of those who join terrorist groups told us that it isn't because they support jihadism, it's because their father or mother or brother was killed by the security forces. So many people have been killed, assassinated, but there has been no justice. And also the kind of war paradigm approach to this problem precludes a government recognition that the root of the violence is coming from other places, namely poverty and frustration with the state. So other researchers have shown that many young people in Burkina Faso are taking up arms as a seasonal job. They're combining violence with agriculture and smuggling. They're joining violent groups not because of identity politics or ethnic affiliations, but because they see fighting as a form of labor and a much needed income generating opportunity. And so the Burkinabe government's military attacks on so-called terrorists do nothing to alleviate poverty or people's despair and anger at state corruption, abandonment, and violence. And these are direct drivers of the conflict. By way of conclusion, I'll just say that the current military approach to militant violence in the Sahel has contributed to the very scenario the US government feared after 9/11. A small group in Algeria, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, has expanded into a considerable wave of fighters, including some affiliated with the Islamic State across many borders. in part because of US and foreign interventions. Many factors have contributed to this spread, but a global view cannot fail to note the central role of the US counterterror narrative and the dollars and the institutional support that props it up. I've focused on the US role in the crisis, but it's important to emphasize that Burkina Faso's government is a primary driver of the violence and must halt its abuses if peace is to be restored. And more broadly about US foreign policy in the Sahel and globally, we can say it's overly skewed towards militarism. So even if US officials speak of working towards other goals like development, the US continues to fund these countries with millions in security assistance each year and provide support for their domestic wars on terror. And yet, as the evidence shows, militarized counterterrorism only shores up human rights abuses, corruption, and authoritarianism, and this is incredibly counterproductive. So I call for reconceptualizing post-9/11 security assistance, even especially in places torn by Islamist militant violence, and for the US government to relinquish its racialized strategy of trying to extend authority to Africa's dark corners. Americans must work towards a different understanding of what it means to protect civilian life, both at home and abroad. So I will end there and open it up to questions.
Oh, thank you so much for that. There's an inflection point in the graph that you have on Burkina Faso military spending.
Yeah.
Right, the steep rise. This reminds me of what happens with the Pakistani military budget post 2002. Steep rise, and it's basically the U.S. and Pakistan is basically paying for the Pakistani military. How much of this budget is actually U.S. spending, and how much of it is Burkina Faso diverting resources from other things, or is that not happening?
Well, that's what it's so there's so little transparency about Burkina Faso's expenditures. It's impossible to say. That's why I kind of had to show this in terms of a correlation with this previous slide. So it's really, and again, even this is only partial accounting. There's been additional kind of investigative research and reporting that's shown that there's tons of money that's not even on this graph that has never been publicly acknowledged that the US has given Burkina Faso. So again, the only way that we can kind of look at these graphs is by looking at them kind of side by side. And unfortunately, I tried my hardest to get some interviews with government officials in Burkina Faso. It's so closed there right now. So
the graph that you have, the one of their military spending, that comes from CIPRI?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what you're suggesting is that, because you've got this 2017, it really goes up in 2017, but you have the sharp drop in the previous slide.
Yeah.
In 2017 it goes much very far down. I'm wondering if what you're showing is actually a shift in total government resources in Burkina Faso. And if you looked at the rest of their spending, if that's what you'd see, and even if the US and France, which I want to ask you about next, were to withdraw, that this would be very sticky because they've got this equipment to maintain and these people who they have to keep paying. And
absolutely.
Is that the case? Is that what you think?
I think so. I think that and again, there's the point about that a lot of these operations are being carried out by that policing unit. So there's a lot that we can't see. But yeah, I think absolutely the Burkinabe government's resources have necessarily shifted. In other words, we can't just explain the spike in their military expenditures by our infusion of dollars. I think it really does signal a shift in the way that they are thinking about how they want to prioritize government spending.
Okay, and then you mentioned France's role.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could say more about that in a couple of respects. One is how much is this different, or France's role different or an escalation from the transition period from colonialism to the present? So is there a major shift post 9/11, or has France sort of essentially never left? And and then secondly, if you could say how much coordination, I don't know if you know this, there is between the United States and France at a doctrinal level.
Doctrinal level, yeah, right. So we see the clear colonial legacy of France's engagement in the region, and France most certainly has never left. It's really kind of intricate, complex involvement in the governments in the West African Sahel. I can't speak necessarily to the kind of transition in the post 9/11 era, but certainly it was kind of the assumed and natural thing that France would kind of go in and take the lead to secure this area. And I think part of the problem with what they're doing, the French talk a lot about kind of propping up the states, the local governments, to kind of deal with this problem. And what they don't acknowledge is that in many cases these are authoritarian governments who are using these kinds of resources and these wars in ways that do serve these kind of repressive ends. So that kind of the discourse of propping up the state, I think, is France's continued kind of colonial lens and motivation. And as far as, the US, I think, does work very closely with the French military. As I mentioned before, the representative at the embassy that I spoke to said it's absolutely essential, and everything I've read points to, especially the fact that the US surveillance operations are key to French actions in the region. And you kind of hear tidbits of things, for example, that in Chad, which has recently kind of gone through this incredible, is going through this incredible crisis right now. But there was a kind of French military camp in Chad that was right next to a U.S. base, and so there were the way that I heard it described was that the kind of field commanders were just crossing a little stretch of field to each other's camps and kind of conferring directly about operations. So I think that there's a lot of ways that the French and the American troops are in really close contact on the ground. And beyond that, I think my paper really speaks to the kind of the rhetorical level, the level of a logic, a broader narrative of a war on terror that the US has created and that France has wholeheartedly adopted. So I think the important point is that if the US were to shift its emphasis and focus on a different approach to dealing with the problem of violence in the region, it would be harder for France to continue with this unquestioned logic and assumption that this war is the way to go. And I'll just say one last thing, which is that President Macron has been very kind of a strong man, saying, France doesn't support negotiations with these Islamist groups. A lot of the local governments now are, especially at the kind of municipal level, are starting to explore what it means to come to local ceasefires and peace agreements with some of the groups. And France has not supported that at a national level, but it seems to be it's fraught and complicated, but it seems to offer a route out of this that Macron hasn't really opened or welcomed the door, opened the door to. So I would be you know, look forward to thinking about what would happen. I think French involvement would shift if the U.S. were to also shift its narrative. You know, France. I've only kind of touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of actually, you know, researching their motivations into all this. But just from my observations, I think I would just reinforce the kind of post-colonial logics of the French involvement in West Africa, and the kind of, you know, paternalistic sense of caring for these the former colonies.
I actually had a question about one of the visuals you showed early on, where more than 80% of the cases, I think, were violent skirmishes. I'm not sure what the cases represented, but more than 80% were solved not through military or violent
Yeah.
means.
Hmm.
And I was struck that there were more successful sort of terrorism outcomes than there were military intervention outcomes. And I wonder if you could tell us anything about the examples of in either category, if you know either specific cases where it was resolved through terrorist violence or resolved through military intervention, or the types of cases where those two things happen.
That's a really good question, Heidi. That slide was based on a paper by Matthew Evangelista on our site that it's from 2011. So we're really working on updating it, and he doesn't mention the examples of those two things, but basically that in some of these cases, I think the idea is that, you know, the militant groups are, you know, they're committing violence for one reason or another, and then they feel like they've accomplished their objectives. You know, that's such a small percentage of the cases in all. So yeah, he doesn't go into depth in those. I'd be really curious as well. But I think the broader point is really about, you know, policing obviously is not necessarily an approach we can wholeheartedly recommend as being without problems, as we all know. But certainly, if you look at kind of incidents, you know, of terrorism in East Africa, in particular, before 9/11, the U.S. was treating those as, you know, like a problem for the FBI, and that there were some really actually successful examples of like FBI infiltrations of, you know, cells, and a kind of dismantling of things from there. So yeah, again, not without its problems, but just to say that the policing paradigm is actually historically more effective.
Right. There's also the work by Audrey Cronin, has a book called How Terrorism Ends, if people are interested in
Great,
following
thanks, Nita.
on that. I wonder also if you could say something about the free equipment. Have you been able to? I know this is not, you're not tracking dollars, but there are giveaways of equipment, sometimes helicopters, trucks, and so on.
There's lots of giveaways, and I don't, yeah, I need to look more into that, because I don't know the exact proportion of like giveaways versus sales and that kind of thing. But I do know that, as you know, as soon as there's lots of justifications and ways in which, you know, something can be, a piece of equipment can kind of be given away, because it's slightly, you know, slightly less up to modern, you know, standards, and justified in that way. So that is definitely happening a lot. And I know, what's the word for armored personnel carriers? I know that that's been something that the Burkina Faso government has been really keen to procure from the U.S. At a broader level, what I'm pushing for is a change in the way that we even think about and talk about how to, you know, keep people safe, right? So there are lots of ways in which the United States informs UN policies and approaches, and certainly we need to, if we can kind of change these fundamental logics of how to kind of deal with this problem of militant violence, that would certainly shift things on a global level of the discourses and the rhetorics and the logics and the narratives that are used.
I wonder though, if you take this larger picture, which is the ways that we understand the conflicts, and at what point we're understanding the origin of the conflict. Because what you've described is this rapid acceleration of ethnic violence between the Fulani and the government. If that's the onset of the problem, or if it's pre-existing problems, so that one response would be a development response, another response might be a healing response or reconciliation response. So, that's I wonder if we want to rethink the problem, and that's I think what you're getting at is rethinking the problem so that we can understand what a different response might be. That's
Yeah,
just,
absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of people trying to kind of get at what is the root of the problem and the conflict really, because one of the fascinating things as I started digging into this research was Burkina Faso has been an incredibly peaceful country actually for generations. It's not natural or self-evident that there would be ethnic conflict between the Mossi and the Fulani, especially because they, since the pre-colonial era have had a relationship in which they've been really interdependent and celebrated life events together and been neighbors. I think that the kind of the repression of the Fulani is in part a response to the opportunities opened by this U.S. war on terror narrative, right? It's not the cause of what's going on, but certainly there's a strong correlation with the kind of intensification of the conflict and cracking down on the Fulani. And why, what have been the trigger points? There's, I think, a lot more research that needs to be done on that. No one has a good answer that I've been able to find. This is the Muslim world that we're talking about in a lot of cases, but I think what we see in United States security and assistance is a strongly racialized sense in which the kind of, US as savior is needing to help Black and brown peoples kick out terrorists, right? And so those are the kind of the problematic identity politics that I would highlight in that situation. And certainly there are lots of ways in which we've kind of entered into various local conflicts and identified certain groups as the good guys and other groups as the bad guys, and gone about it with this kind of really blunt approach. And that precisely is what exacerbates some of the dynamics in exactly the ways that I was describing in Burkina Faso. So we've seen it in Yemen, with the ways that we've assisted the president and his suppression of the Houthis and all of those kinds of it's happened kind of across the board. A lot of the work that I did to document combat operations, especially around the world, that's not transparent. There's no, US government acknowledgement in any kind of a public way about a lot of those cases. I found through investigative reporting and just kind of like tracking case by case and backing it up. And there are officially acknowledged operations, and then there are lots of ways in which the US is using special operations and kind of covert budgetary authorities. There's one that Politico has done some reporting on called the 127 ECHO program, which is a budgetary authority that allows US forces to kind of go in with partner forces on the ground and control raids and really direct things on the ground, even though it's technically the partner forces that are doing the actual raid. So there's lots of ways in which the government continues to be incredibly opaque on all this stuff, and we need to kind of push. And I will say that, especially with this news about the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, that US security assistance is the the kind of going to be one of the most important fronts that this, militarized approach to counterterrorism is going to be continued to be carried out. So as I think as peace groups and people who are pushing the U.S. government to do a better job on all these issues, that's the security assistance is the thing that people really need to be growing awareness on, and it's incredibly opaque.
So you were talking about the increased number of military mutinies.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about that? Is it the case that the U.S. military and the French military assistance is actually fracturing the Burkina Faso military? What's the cause of these mutinies?
Yeah, I don't think we can say that at all, because these actually have a long history, and there's been a long history of military coups and ways in which the military has been involved in domestic politics in a lot of these countries in really, really incredibly complicated ways that I won't even go into the details. But in Burkina Faso, it's still very very prevalent. So I wouldn't say that U.S. and French assistance is contributing to that. But I think the point is just that when we talk about illicit profiteering, that the all evidence points to the fact that there probably are really wealthy, powerful, elite military officials who are profiting from U.S. and French security assistance. But of course, that's like, it was impossible for me to sort through what that actually means, because who's going to tell you anything about that? But it's just, that was just kind of for me, a way to kind of indicate that these kinds of things are very likely happening.
All right. Well, thank you. So with that, I thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie Savell, anthropologist extraordinaire, for this conversation and the big picture and the more detailed picture. So thank you very much. And I also thank the Pardee Center for its generous support, technical and otherwise, of the entire series, but especially for today. So John, we're going to thank you representing the Pardee Center. And then Heidi Peltier, thanks also for setting up the entire series. And I just got to be here to hang out with you. So thanks very much.